getting towards our end of the Roman Empire, and we've kind of seen this long ride of Rome from the monarchy, which we didn't talk much about, the Roman Republic, which we spent a lot of time on its rise and fall, and now we've been kind of discussing all these Roman emperors. We had gone through the Julio-Claudian line. We talked about the adopted emperors that got us to kind of the peak of the Roman Empire, right? And what we need to cover today is kind of what happens. The big objective of the lecture is what happens after that peak. And what we're basically going to see is kind of the crisis, a recovery from a crisis period, and then the eventual fall of the Roman Empire. So there's, still a bit of this roller coaster ride still to get through. So let's start with our key. So here are the key words that we're going to need to kind of know in terms of the beginning of the fall of the Roman Empire. And so the fall of the Roman Empire, again, it's a bit of a roller coaster ride, right? The Roman Empire starts, you have that Pax Romana period, things are going well, then we get to the peak here, the Golden Age. Now we're going to enter this crisis period, and then things are going to recover and then decline again. So what we're doing right now is looking at this period right now, the crisis of the 3rd century, when things start to go downhill. We call it the crisis of the 3rd century, but technically it starts at the end of the 2nd century with Commodus. So who is Commodus? Well, Commodus was the son of Marcus Aurelius, if you remember, and he was a horrible ruler, right? It's not a surprise. He's the first emperor after the Golden Age. He is lazy, he is irresponsible, he's unreliable. Sometimes I just kind of describe him as your drunken frat boy, your stereotypical drunken frat boy. And that's Commodus. He cares more about the women and enjoying life than ruling over this massive empire. So that's where the decline kind of begins. As we get into the crisis of the 3rd century, there are a lot of emperors, and I'm not going to go through all of them. You'd kill me if I go through all of them and make you know all of them. Instead, I kind of group a whole bunch of them together in what we call the Baric emperors. And this is these years, 235 to 284. So this is kind of the heart of the crisis of the 3rd century. During this time period, you have about, 50-year time period, roughly, excuse me, excuse me, roughly, one second. All right, sorry about that. So roughly about 25 emperors in a 50-year period. So these are the Baric emperors. I'm not going to go through them all. I'm just going to read off real quickly, however, how each one of their reigns ends. Remember, we had this period of time of the Golden Age. We had 5 emperors, and they all died of natural causes, and that lasted 100 years. So this is 25 emperors roughly in a 50-year period, and this is what fate they each meet. So here we go. I'm not even going to give you their names. I'm just going to tell you what happens to them. First one's murdered by his army, then killed in a civil war, killed in civil war, murdered by guards, murdered by guards, murdered by guards, killed in civil war, killed in battle, killed in civil war, murdered by army, dies in captivity, murdered by army, dies of plague, murdered by bodyguard, murdered by army, murdered by army, murdered by army. One may have died naturally, murdered by bodyguard, and killed in civil war. All right, so there you go. And so you don't need to memorize all that or anything, but obviously I did that to give you a sense of what's going on. It's a mess, right? We throw around the word crisis pretty quickly. This is a real crisis, right? Try to imagine every other year on the average a new president of the United States because the CIA takes one out and there's a civil war and the Secret Service takes one out, and it would be crazy, right? That's what's going on here in the Roman Empire. The only one of these Baric emperors that you need to know is this man named Gallienus, and he was emperor from 253 to 268. Part of it was along with his father. But during his time, the fact that he ruled longer didn't mean he was better. It meant he was kind of luckier in some ways. And if he ruled for about 15 years, that means if you start doing the math, some of these other guys ruled for what, months? I think the shortest was like 87 days. I think it came across a Roman emperor. So during his time, all these problems are going to grip the Roman Republic, the Roman Empire, right? So jot them down and go to a map here to show it to you. But pirates, earthquake, invasions, plagues, and the city of Alexandria. What's going on here? Let me just show you on the map here. So during this crisis of the 3rd century, during the reign of Gallienus, and really the entire crisis, you have 2 major earthquakes. One in Rome, one in Asia Minor. That's a problem. This is other than the whole killing of rulers and all that. Another problem is you have a plague here in the city of Alexandria. You have a massive plague, kills about half the population. Now remember, the population of Alexandria was about 1 million people. So it kills half that, about 500,000 people killed by the plague, half the population. When we deal with things like, COVID, and you look at how devastating that has been to our society in many ways, and you do the math, it's killed something, I think I did the math on this, was 0.000 something percent of our population right now. Not the death mortality, I'm talking about what percentage of the population has been killed. This killed about half the population, not of all of Rome, but of the city of Alexandria. So that's pretty devastating, right? It would be the equivalent of, let's say, I don't know, population of what big city, I don't know how many people are living in Los Angeles County, about 10 million, be like 5 million people dying just in Los Angeles County. That would be the approximation. So you have that. You have pirates returning into the Mediterranean Sea. That's causing problem. You have invasions. Now, who is invading? Well, those German tribes, right? Remember during the Golden Age, it was Rome moving there. Now those German tribes, they're coming in, they're invading. So all of these are problems during the crisis of the 3rd century. So when you talk about the Baric emperors or Gallienus, right, you're talking about all these specific things in terms of the problems that took place. There also seems to be some evidence that Rome is starting to have a population shortage, and some people believe this could be some illnesses. One of the things is Rome expands and grows, and you make contact with other people, those individuals bring with them diseases that you may not be as immune to, and things of that nature. So there's a lot of problems gripping Rome in the crisis of the 3rd century, which leads to the question is, well, why didn't Rome just collapse in the crisis of the 3rd century? And they could have, and in many respects, maybe they were very close to completely collapsing at that point. Why don't they? Well, because that crisis ends in the year 284. And it ends in the year 284 because after this long series of horrible leaders, they have one particular emperor who is very strong, very capable. Not very well known. He's oftentimes, they say, the most important Roman emperor most people have never heard of before, and it is the Roman Emperor Diocletian. So we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about Diocletian and why he's important. All right, so this is what I call the recovery period under the Roman Emperor Diocletian. He's emperor for about 20 years, and we're going to talk about several things he's going to do. There's going to be like 3-4 major things he's going to be involved in. So we're going to spend probably more time. Oh, there's one other guy we're going to spend a lot of time on for obvious reasons, but we're going to spend a bit of time on Diocletian here. So here we go. All right, so these are the key words for Diocletian. You want to get all of this down. And the reason Diocletian is so important, again, if you need to pause to get him down, so, as I keep talking here, that's fine. The reason Diocletian is so important is he's going to be involved in, like I said, 3-4 really major things. He's going to be involved in an administrative reform, something we call the Tetrarchy, military reforms, economic reforms, and he's going to be involved a little bit with the issue of Christianity. And especially for the first two, right? Those first two especially, these are things that Diocletian does that basically save the Roman Empire in the short term. In the long term, these are also things he does that will help bring an end to the Roman Empire. And so that's what you want to be paying attention to as well. There were some economic reforms, and the issue of Christianity we'll touch as well. So you have the word tetrarchy. What does that word tetrarchy mean? It basically means rule of 4. And what he's going to realize, I'm going to show you a map here in a second, is that the Roman Empire is massive, and it was very hard for one guy sitting in the city of Rome to administrate over everything. So what he decides to do is create 4 people, an Augustus and a Caesar, and another Augustus and another Caesar. That's where so these are titles, not people, right? So be careful on that. And essentially what he's going to do is, I'm going to go to the map here, so make sure you have the keywords down here if you need to pause it to get the keywords. But let me go to the map, it'll be more clear. I'm going to show you here, first of all, a picture. So here's just a picture of the Tetrarchy. You see these 4 men. And initially, when people look at this image, if I ask you what's the first thing you notice about this image, most people almost automatically say they're hugging, but then notice they're also holding their swords. And so the thing Diocletian says is, I'm going to have these 4 men rule over Rome, right? Now, I'm still the guy. I am still the emperor, but I am one of these four men, but I am above all of them, right? And what these four men are going to do, the two Augusti and the two Caesar, they're going to govern over the Roman Empire administratively. So here's our map, right? So what he does, don't worry about the four colors. Really, what I'm mainly concerned about is the split right here in the center. And what Diocletian says, instead of having an emperor sitting in Rome, having to just govern over this massive piece of real estate, instead what he says, I'm going to have two guys, right? A Augustus over here in Rome, and Augustus sitting in another city called Byzantium. This is Byzantium. It's gone through a few name changes. For now, just know it as Byzantium. And each of them has an assistant to Caesar. And their jobs are this. The Augustus and the Caesar, they're only responsible for the western part of Rome. And the Augustus Caesar sitting in Byzantium are only responsible for the administrative systems in the eastern part of Rome. The tax collection, the troop movements, whatever you need to do. And administratively, this is very effective. Remember, there's no cell phones, no Snapchat, no Twittering and all of that. You don't have all these things, right? And so what you end up with is very slow communication. And so this avoids that, and it makes things move a lot smoother. So in the short run, it's effective. In the long run, there's a problem. And what is the problem in the long run? The problem in the long run is you just divided Rome. You've basically set a precedent that you could split Rome in half. And I want you to keep that in mind because it's going to come back to be important later on, right? As we continue on and discuss more of the Roman Empire here. Because if you can split it administratively, you start to create differences, different cultures, different attitudes, different values, and this is going to eventually split the Roman world. So that's going to be important. The other thing is just an interesting note is Diocletian says, I want to rule over the East, not the West. Why would he pick the East? Well, it makes sense. You'd pick the East instead of the West because the West is weaker, right? The West is where the Germanic invasions are coming. They don't have many people to trade with. You got the Atlantic Ocean here. Who are you going to trade with, right? The East is much more stable. And so he sees that, and we're seeing a shift of power of Rome during this period of time from the west to the east. So that's one. All right, the second major reform is going to be the military reform. One of the things, the problem the Roman world was having is they had these massive borders that they needed to defend. And so what Diocletian is going to do is reform the military. How? If you remember, I said there were 5,000 men in a Roman legion. What Diocletian is going to do, he's going to reduce that to 1,000 men. And by doing that, you have a more mobile army. You can move them to different parts. So if you have an invasion, you can move troops very quickly to that area. But of course, what that also does is make those legions smaller. But it is more mobile. They're more effective in covering more ground, and that helps defend the borders. But there's another key point to his military reforms, and this is a big one that you really need to understand. When Diocletian realizes that the Roman borders are so big, and this isn't just going to end with Diocletian, this is going to continue on, the Romans understand they need more men. They just don't have enough men to defend these big borders. And you can, create smaller legions, that's not enough. You need more men. Where do you get more men from? And one of the things the Romans will start doing is they start bringing in mercenaries. Who are mercenaries? What are mercenaries? Well, mercenaries are hired troops, foreign hired troops. Who does they start bringing in, the Romans? They start bringing in these Germanic tribes. And these Germanic tribes enter the Roman Empire as soldiers for Rome. Now, you should all be thinking, that's a problem. And there's an obvious reason why this is a problem and a less obvious reason. You want to know both. The obvious reason is these guys aren't loyal to Rome. They're only fighting for Rome for money. As soon as things get a little bit hectic, they're going to bail. They're going to jump ship, right? And so that's one issue right there that you have with Rome. The other issue with these Germanic tribes, the other issue, and a lot more subtle, but just as important, is as these Germanic tribes are coming in, especially to the western part of Rome, they are bringing in with them their families. They're bringing in them their culture, their language, their way of life. Guys, what makes a civilization a civilization? If you don't have common language, culture, traditions, customs, right? You're not much of a civilization. You just fragment. And this is a very important lesson for any civilization, especially ours in the United States. I'm an immigrant. I'm first generation college student. English is not my first language, and I say this as an immigrant. Well, immigration is great. That's one of our greatest strengths as a nation. But if you have immigration and especially in our nation where people are immigrating from all over the place, and people do not assimilate, don't find those things to share in common, that's dangerous because over time you start fragmenting. And if you don't have common language, common beliefs, common cores now, of things that bond you, can we still maintain our differences and our different, cultural things that we all enjoy? And yes, you can. But there's also needs to be strong things that bond you. Language is very important. That's one of the big ones. The ideas that we believe in the Bill of Rights. Certain things are very important that bond you, or you're just nothing. You just fall apart and you fragment. So it's just kind of important little life lesson. Anyway, so that's the military reforms. There's an economic reform. It's something called the Edict of Maximum Prices. I didn't even put that down there for you. Essentially, it's just this idea that there was a lot of inflation during the crisis of the 3rd century. So Diocletian says, I'm going to stop inflation by issuing an Edict of Maximum Prices. You only can charge so much for goods and services. If you charge more than that, you're dead. And that stops inflation lickety split, right? Pretty quickly. And so, just kind of this other interesting reform. And then the last issue that I do want to spend a little more time on, not so much with Diocletian, but as we move forward, is the issue of Christianity. So let me go to another map. So I hope you got all that. So first of all, definitely the Tetrarchy, definitely the military reforms. Those are two really big ones. Understand that. The Edict of Maximum Prices, you should note that, obviously if you're doing an ID on Diocletian, for example, it's something that you'd probably want to know. And by the way, you should be getting, if I either post it this week or be posted soon, is your review sheet for the midterm. I'm sorry, for the final. I'm already going to put kind of that final up there. So look for that as well, because you're going to get the essays and the IDs and all of that to start preparing. So I'm going to give it to you a little bit earlier than I did before the midterm. So just kind of be a lookout for that. Anyway, so you have all that. And then you have one more issue. And the last issue is the issue of Christianity. So let me go to this map. So on this map, what we're looking at is the spread of Christianity in the Roman Empire. And understanding this, of course, is going to be very important moving forward as we kind of end the ancient world and move on to the Middle Ages. But what you're looking at, if you look at the dark orange, is basically the spread of Christianity from about the year 1 to the year 300. And you can see it's very small. During this time, maybe 5–10% of the Roman population had been Christianized. Most of the area was not under Christian influence. It was still pretty much a pagan society under Rome. And during the reign of Diocletian, and why was that? Why were there so few Christians? Well, of course, during the early rise of Christianity from the year 1 up to the year 300, including during the time of Diocletian, if you came out publicly and you were a Christian, there was a good chance you would face persecution and even death, right? If you remember in the Nero video when he blamed the Christians for the fire in Rome. And there are various emperors, depending on which emperor was around the time, there was either more persecutions or less persecutions. And there were times where, you might have pagans and Christians living next to each other without, persecutions taking place, but it often happened, where there were. And during the time of Diocletian, you had that as well. Diocletian was known for burning the sacred books, imprisoning clergy members. Oftentimes, people see Diocletian as kind of the last major persecution of Christians in the Roman Empire. One of the interesting things you get as a result of this is that Christians often had to pray silently and in secret during the Roman Empire. So you get a couple things out of that. One that maybe some of you are familiar with. You've seen this before. Maybe you've seen the symbol of the fish, right? I'll just draw it here, my terrible drawing there. But that was one symbol that Christians would use to let each other know that they were fellow Christians praying. One would draw half the fish, the other draw the other half the fish. And that one is still around. So that was one way. Then recently I kind of learned about another interesting kind of cryptic message that Christians would use to also let each other know that they were Christians, in a way to pray together and know that there's a kind of a safe area for them without Roman persecution. And it's a pretty amazing find. So let me show it to you. It's this thing called the Rhoda Square. And I don't know if anybody's heard of this. I've only recently heard of it, so I thought, oh, this is cool. I'm going to kind of add it to my lecture. And if you look at it, it's a bunch of Latin words. And if you look at it carefully, you could see how the letters, it's what's it called when palindrome, right? It's a palindrome. And so you see the letters and they go forward, backwards. So the R-O-T-A, what looks R-O-T-A, this is all Latin, right? And it goes both ways, and it goes also up and down and so forth. Now, if you just translate it for what it is, it's almost a bit of gibberish. It doesn't make much sense. I've seen a couple different translations, either like the farmer or repo works wheel, or the farmer uses his plow to work. And initially, it doesn't really make much sense. And by the way, this goes back to about the 1st century. Actually, one of these was discovered in Pompeii. You know, remember that place where the big volcano exploded and everyone was frozen in ash? So that's where they initially found this. So back during the 1st century period. And so for a long time, people like weren't sure where that is. But eventually, what people were able to figure out is this is all kind of can be deciphered. And if you take these letters and you kind of rearrange them and you rearrange this Rhoda square, this is actually what you get. You get this word Pater Noster. And what does that mean? It basically is our Father. And in a lot of prayers, the first words of the prayers, of the prayers, our Father. And then the A and O, the Alpha Omega, beginning, the end. And so this was kind of a way Christians would use. Only other Christians apparently understood how to decipher this, and this was a way for Christians also to pray with each other without worrying about Roman persecution. So I just thought that was kind of an interesting little thing I learned about recently. So anyways, during the time of Diocletian, you had that persecution taking place. And let's go back to our map. And when again we look at our map and spread of the Christian faith again, up to this period during Diocletian's reign, there wasn't very widespread. Now, if you look at the green on this map, there is a lot of it. And that's the spread of Christianity after Diocletian. And so you can see it's pretty much the entire Roman Empire. And so the question is, what happens right around the year 300 AD, roughly, a little bit after that, which is going to begin to transform the Roman world from a pagan world to a Christian world? And, the ramification of this goes well beyond Rome, of course. If you think of Western civilization and you think of world history, there are, a couple billion Christians in the world today, if you take all the different denominations. So understanding, how that spread of Christianity really began to flourish in Rome is pretty important. And that's the topic we're going to talk about in our next lecture. So that's where the next thing is going to pick up on, and we'll go from there. All right, hope all that's clear. Let me know if you have any questions. Thank you.